The snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping. Molly knew this because she had counted the marks on the wooden beam above her cot. 1 scratch for each morning she woke up, and the world outside was still white, still silent, still indifferent. 3 scratches. 3 mornings without a proper meal. 3 nights listening to the wind push through the gaps in the old cottage walls like something alive and hungry. She pulled her wool cloak tighter around her shoulders and stared at the fire she was trying to keep alive. The embers were almost gone. She had used the last split log the night before, and the small pile of kindling near the door was barely enough to last through the afternoon. She could feel the cold pressing in from the stone floor beneath her feet, even through the worn leather of her boots. Boots that had been resoled twice already and were starting to separate at the left toe again. Outside, the valley was buried. The village of Dunrath sat at the foot of the northern hills, and in winter it became a place that the rest of the world forgot entirely. The roads were impassable. The traders who sometimes stopped there in autumn were long gone. And Molly, who had lived on the edge of that village for 2 years without anyone asking why or how, was alone. She was 24 years old, and she had learned not to expect much from the world. The cottage had come with almost nothing: a rusted iron hook above the hearth, a cot with a straw mattress, and a narrow shelf where she kept what little she owned. 3 jars, a short knife, a comb with 2 missing teeth, a small cloth pouch that had once held coin and now held only a folded piece of paper she never opened. She kept meaning to burn that paper. She never did. Rex was lying near the door, his gray muzzle resting on his front paws, his amber eyes half closed. He was a large dog, mixed breed, with a heavy coat that had gone pale with age. She had found him injured at the edge of the forest 2 summers ago, and he had never left. He was old and slow, and sometimes his back legs gave out when he tried to stand too fast. But he was warm and steady, and he had never once looked at her the way people in Dunrath sometimes did, with that particular mixture of pity and suspicion reserved for someone who didn't quite belong. She trusted Rex more than she had trusted most people in her life. It was Rex who lifted his head first. Molly was scraping the last bits of dried oat from the bottom of the clay pot when she heard it, a low sound from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something between warning and wonder. She set the pot down and looked at him. His ears were forward. His eyes were fixed on the eastern wall of the cottage, the wall that faced the long hill that rose behind the village, the hill the people of Dunrath called the Grey Back, because in winter, the rock face showed through the snow like old bones through skin. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her. He stood up slowly, joints creaking, and walked to the door. He pressed his nose against the gap at the bottom and inhaled, long and deliberate, like he was reading something she couldn't see. Then he barked. Once. Sharp. Loud enough that Molly's heart jumped. Rex almost never barked. She wrapped her cloak around herself, tied the laces of her boots quickly, and opened the door. The cold hit her face like a flat stone. The snow was still falling, fine and dry, the kind that found every gap in your clothing and melted against your skin before you could brush it away. The village below was quiet. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but no one was outside. The Grey Back rose to the east, half hidden in the low clouds, enormous and gray and indifferent. Rex walked past her into the snow without hesitation. "Rex!" She called after him, but he didn't stop. He moved with unusual purpose for an old dog, his paws punching through the thin crust of ice on top of the snowpack, heading east, heading toward the hill. Molly stood at the door for a moment. The smart thing, the careful thing, was to stay inside, keep the fire from dying. Wait. She had been doing the smart thing for 2 years, and she was still hungry and cold and alone. She followed him. The walk up the lower slope of the Grey Back took longer than it should have. The snow was deep and uneven, hiding rocks and roots beneath it. And twice Molly lost her footing and had to catch herself with her hands, the wet cold soaking immediately through her gloves. Rex moved ahead of her, slower than he used to be but steady, his gray coat disappearing and reappearing against the white. She called to him twice. He didn't slow down. By the time she had climbed high enough to feel the wind change, sharper now, carrying the smell of pine resin and something else, something mineral and dark, Rex had stopped. He was standing at the base of a stone outcropping she had never noticed before, though she had looked up at this hill 100 times. The rocks formed a kind of natural wall, angled in a way that deflected the wind, and behind them, half buried in a snowdrift that had built up against the stone, there was a door. Not a cave. A door. Wooden, old, iron-banded, set into the rock face itself. Molly stood in the snow and stared at it. Rex was not barking at it. He was sitting beside it, tail moving slowly, waiting for her. The way he waited at her door every morning until she opened it and let him in from the cold. She looked back down the hill. Dunrath was small below her, its rooftops white, its streets empty. No one had followed her. No one had seen her go. She looked at the door again. There was no lock she could see. The iron handle was thick with rust but still solid. Someone had built this. Someone had set it into the hillside deliberately, angled to catch the shadow of the outcropping, invisible from below unless you were standing almost exactly where she was standing now. She reached out and pressed her hand against the wood. It was cold but dry, protected by the rock overhang above it. Old, very old, but not rotted. She pulled the handle. The door opened. The smell hit her first. Dry wood, old pine, something faintly smoky, and beneath it all, the dense, unmistakable smell of stored food. Grain, dried herbs, smoked meat. Her stomach contracted painfully at the scent, the way a hand closes around something it has wanted for a long time. Inside, the space was larger than the entrance suggested. The ceiling was low, cut stone with wooden beams reinforcing it, but the room extended back into the hill far enough that she couldn't see the rear wall in the dim light. She stepped inside, and Rex followed her, and the wind outside became a distant sound. There were shelves along both walls, rough wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, and on them, Molly stopped breathing for a moment. Sacks of grain, sealed clay jars, dozens of them, bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, rounds of hard cheese wrapped in dark cloth, smoked fish bound in salt-crusted paper, root vegetables in wicker baskets, still firm, packed in dry straw. Barrels, small ones, stacked on their sides, and when she knelt and pressed her ear against one, she could hear the faint sound of liquid inside. Enough food to last a person through the winter. Through 2 winters, maybe. She stood in the middle of it, her cloak dripping snowmelt onto the stone floor, her hands trembling, not from cold. Rex sat down beside her and leaned his warm weight against her leg. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt grateful. She did. She did feel both of those things, flooding through her chest, sudden and disorienting. But beneath them, quieter and colder, was a different feeling entirely. Someone put this here. And the question that followed that thought, the question she couldn't push away, no matter how much the smell of smoked meat and dried grain pulled at her hunger. Who? She did not take anything that first day. She stood in that stone room for a long time, long enough for the light outside to begin to fade and turn orange through the half-open door. She walked the length of the shelves slowly, reading the jars. Some were sealed with wax, some with cloth tied tight with cord. Everything was organized. Everything was deliberate. This was not an accident, not an abandoned cache left by some long-dead traveler. The straw in the root vegetable baskets was recent. The wax on some of the jars was still pale, not yet yellowed. Someone had stocked this place recently. Someone was maintaining it, She closed the door carefully when she left, making sure it sat flush against the frame. She walked back down the hill with Rex at her side, her mind turning the discovery over and over like a stone she couldn't identify. That night, she sat by the dying fire and did not scratch a fourth mark on the beam. She stared at the embers instead, listening to the wind, listening to Rex breathe slowly on the floor beside her. She was going to have to make a choice. She understood that. And she understood, in the way she had learned to understand things, quietly, without anyone telling her, that the choice she made next would change everything. She went back the next morning. Molly told herself it was only to look again, to be certain she had not imagined it, the way hunger sometimes made the mind build things that weren't there. She had heard of that happening. A woman in the village had once told her that her grandfather, lost in a snowstorm for 2 days, had seen a warm hearth glowing between the trees, had walked toward it for an hour before realizing it was moonlight on a frozen pond. The mind, when desperate enough, became generous with illusions. But Rex had seen it too, or smelled it, and Rex did not invent things. She dressed before dawn, layering what she had, the wool cloak over a linen shirt, and a heavier tunic she had patched at both elbows, thick stockings inside her boots, the left toe now stuffed with a strip of cloth to keep the cold out. She wrapped a length of undyed wool around her neck and shoulders, and filled a small leather sack with nothing, because she still hadn't decided whether she was going to take anything. The snow had stopped overnight. The sky above the valley was pale and sharp, the kind of winter morning that was beautiful in a way that didn't care whether you appreciated it or not. Her breath came out in clouds. Rex walked beside her, not ahead this time. Beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his coat against her left leg. The door was exactly as she had left it. She pulled it open, stepped inside, and stood still for a moment while her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The smell was the same. Pine and smoke and grain, a smell that had followed her into sleep the night before and wrapped itself around her dreams. She moved to the nearest shelf and lifted one of the smaller jars, turned it in her hands. The wax seal was stamped with something, a mark she didn't recognize, angular and precise, pressed into the red wax before it had hardened. She set it down carefully. She was reaching for one of the dried herb bundles, just to smell it, just to feel something real and certain in her hands, when Rex made the sound again. Not the sharp bark from the day before, something lower, a warning. Molly went still. She heard it a moment later. Footsteps in the snow outside. Heavy, deliberate, not trying to be quiet. A single pair of boots, and the sound was coming closer. She looked at the door. She had left it half open behind her, the way she'd found it. There was nowhere to go in the small room. No second exit. No shadows deep enough to hide in. She pressed her back against the shelves, her hand finding the short knife at her belt more by instinct than intention. The footsteps stopped just outside. A pause, long enough that she counted 7 heartbeats. Then a voice, deep, even, and carrying no particular emotion she could name. "You left footprints in the snow." Molly said nothing. "Yours and a dog's." Another pause. "The dog's prints are old." Back legs dragged slightly on the right side. A beat. "He's been coming up this hill longer than you have." That surprised her enough that she spoke. "Rex has never come up here before yesterday." Silence. Then, "I know. I meant the prints from yesterday." She heard him shift his weight. He did not come through the door. He was standing just outside it, and the quality of the light from the entrance changed slightly, blocked, partially, by something large. "Are you going to come out?" he said. "Or should I come in?" "Neither seems like a good option for me," she said. Something that might have been amusement moved through the pause that followed. "Fair." She tightened her grip on the knife, then deliberately loosened it. Pulling a knife on whoever had built this shelter and stocked it with enough food to feed a village was not going to end well for her. She released the handle entirely, smoothed her cloak, and walked to the door. He was taller than she expected, which was saying something, because she had already prepared herself for someone large. He stood in the snow just below the stone outcropping, and he was wearing a heavy, dark cloak over what looked like a leather jerkin and thick wool trousers tucked into boots that came to the knee. His hair was dark, cut short at the sides but longer on top, and there was a quality to his stillness that reminded her of the way old trees stood, not rigid, but deeply rooted. Like moving was a choice he made deliberately, not something that simply happened to him. He looked at her with gray eyes that were calm in a way she found immediately unsettling. Rex, standing at her side, was not growling. His tail was not moving either. He was simply watching the man with the same careful attention he gave to things he hadn't decided about yet. "You're from the village," the man said, not a question. "I live at the edge of it," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." He looked at her steadily. "Molly Vane." The sound of her name and his voice stopped her cold. "You know who I am." "I know most people in this valley." He glanced at the door behind her, then back at her face. His expression was difficult to read, not hostile, not warm, measured. "You've been here 2 winters." 2 years, she corrected. "I arrived in late spring." 2 winters, he repeated, as though that were the more important measurement. "And this one nearly finished you." She didn't answer that, because it was accurate, and she didn't see the use in confirming it. "Who are you?" she asked instead. He didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky, a brief, automatic gesture, like checking the weather, and then back at her. "Valen," he said. Just the one name. No family name offered, no title, no explanation of where he had come from, or what he was doing on this hill on a morning cold enough to freeze the words before they left your mouth. "This is yours," she said, gesturing toward the shelter behind her. "The food." "Yes, I didn't take anything." "I know." He said it without accusation or approval, simply as a statement of fact, the way you might note that the sun had risen. She studied him for a moment. He was watching her with an attention that was thorough without being aggressive, taking in details the way someone accustomed to reading situations quickly would. She had seen that look before, on certain people. People who had learned that information was the most reliable form of protection available. "Why is it here?" she asked. The question seemed to settle something in him. His posture shifted, almost imperceptible, but she noticed. "Because winter is long," he said, "and not everyone makes it through." It was not the full answer. She knew it wasn't the full answer, but there was something in the plainness of it that she couldn't argue with. Rex took 2 steps forward through the snow and sat down at the man's feet. Molly stared at her dog. Rex, who had taken 3 weeks to approach her without flinching when she'd first found him, who had snapped at the village blacksmith last spring for reaching toward him without warning, who trusted almost no one and had impeccable judgment about who deserved that distrust. Rex sat at this stranger's feet as though he had known him for years. Valen looked down at the dog. Something crossed his face. Quickly. There and gone. Something that was not the measured stillness of a moment before. "You should take what you need," he said, still looking at Rex. "That's what it's for." Chapter 3. The Skeptic at the Gate. She didn't tell anyone in the village. She went back up the hill 3 more times over the following week, each time taking only what she needed for the next few days. A measure of grain, a bundle of dried herbs, a small piece of smoked fish wrapped carefully to keep the smell from drawing animals to the cottage. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about most things. because being careless with resources was the kind of mistake that only felt small until it wasn't. She did not see Valen again on those visits, but she knew he had been there. The straw in the baskets was rearranged twice. Once, a new bundle of dried apples appeared on the second shelf. She was certain it hadn't been there before. The stone floor near the door had been swept clear of the snow she'd tracked in. Someone was tending this place regularly, quietly, without making it obvious. She was thinking about this on the 7th day, walking back down the hill with her leather sack over her shoulder and Rex at her heel, when she nearly walked into Petra. Petra ran the only alehouse in Dunrath, which made her the person who knew everything about everyone in the valley, whether they wanted her to or not. She was perhaps 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pinned back severely, and a manner of looking at people that suggested she had already decided what they were going to say before they opened their mouths. She was standing at the edge of the lower path with a bundle of firewood under one arm, and she was looking up the hill with an expression Molly had never seen on her before. Unease. Unmistakably. "You were up there," Petra said, not accusing, reporting. "I was walking," Molly said carefully, "on the gray back." Petra shifted the firewood. Her eyes moved from Molly's face to the sack on her shoulder, and something flickered in them. "Did you go near the north face? Near the outcropping?" Molly kept her expression even. "Why?" Petra was quiet for a moment. She looked back up the hill, then at Molly, and her jaw tightened. "There are stories about that hill, about what lives on it." "It's a hill," Molly said. "Snow lives on it." "People talk," Petra said flatly, "about lights up there at night, about sounds in winter that don't come from any animal anyone can name." She paused. "About him." "Him," Molly repeated. Petra looked at her steadily. "Valen. They say he's been in this valley longer than anyone can remember. They say he doesn't age the way people age. They say—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "They say he isn't entirely what he looks like." The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the path, and for a moment the sound it made was low and resonant, almost like a voice. "What does he look like?" Molly asked. "A man," Petra said, "until he doesn't." Molly held the woman's gaze. Petra was not someone who frightened easily. She had run her alehouse through 2 floods, a fire, and a winter outbreak of fever that had taken 6 people from the village. She was practical and direct, and did not traffic in rumor without reason. The unease on her face was real. "Stay off that hill," Petra said quietly. "Whatever he offered you, it isn't free. Nothing from him ever is." She turned and walked back toward the village without waiting for a response. Molly stood on the path for a long moment, the cold settling into her shoulders, Rex pressing warm and steady against her leg. She thought about the door set into the hillside, the organized shelves, the bundle of dried apples that had appeared overnight. She thought about Valen's gray eyes, and the way he had gone still when Rex sat at his feet. "Until he doesn't," Petra had said. Molly looked up at the hill. Then she pulled her cloak tighter and walked home. And she did not tell herself she wasn't going back, because she had learned, over the course of her life, that lying to herself was one of the more expensive habits a person could develop. The snow came again on the 8th night, heavier this time. Molly woke to the sound of it. Not the snow itself, which made no sound, but the silence it created. That particular muffled stillness that meant the world outside had been reshaped while she slept. She lay on her cot for a moment, listening, then sat up and looked at the fire. She had banked it carefully before sleeping, and it had held through the night. A small victory, the kind she had learned to count deliberately. Rex was already awake, sitting by the door, his ears forward. "Not yet," she told him. "Let it get light first." She used the extra time to think. She had been doing a great deal of thinking since her conversation with Petra on the path. Turning the woman's words over, the way you turned a suspect coin, testing its weight, looking for where it rang false. Until he doesn't. It was the kind of warning that told you almost nothing, and yet landed with the weight of something that knew exactly what it was doing. She thought about what she knew. Valen had built a shelter and stocked it with enough food to carry several people through a hard winter. He had not hidden it from her when she found it. He had not threatened her, had not demanded anything from her, had not even, and this was the detail she kept returning to, told her not to come back. He had said, "Take what you need," simply, without conditions she could identify. She had met people who offered things without conditions. They were rare. In her experience, they were either genuinely good or extraordinarily dangerous, and the trouble was that from the outside, those two things could look almost identical until it was too late to tell the difference. She needed more information. The alehouse in Dunrath was a low building, with a heavy door and two small windows that let in almost no light, which was possibly intentional. It smelled of wood smoke and barley, and the particular earthiness of a space where many people had spent time being more honest than they intended. Molly did not go there often. She could rarely afford what Petra charged, and she found the way conversation stopped and restarted when she entered tiring. But that morning, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. There were 4 people there. 2 old men playing stones at the corner table, a young farmer named Duff, who worked land at the valley's south end, and came to the village once a week for supplies, sitting alone with a cup of something warm. And behind the bar, Petra, who looked at Molly when she entered and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Molly sat at the bar. "I'll take something hot," she said. "I can pay." She set 2 small coins on the wood, her last 2, which she had decided last night was a reasonable price for information. Petra looked at the coins, then at her face, and turned to fill a cup from the pot hanging above the kitchen hearth. She set it in front of Molly without comment. It was barley broth, thin but hot, and Molly wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth work its way into her palms before she spoke. "Tell me about Valen," she said quietly. Petra leaned both hands on the bar. Her expression was not surprised exactly, more resigned. "I told you to stay off that hill." "You told me stories about lights and sounds," Molly said. "I'm asking for facts. What do people actually know about him?" A silence. The 2 old men in the corner were deep in their game. Duff was staring into his cup. Petra picked up a cloth and began wiping the bar. A gesture Molly had learned meant the woman was deciding how much to say. "He's been in this valley since before my mother was born," she said finally, keeping her voice low. "My mother remembered him from when she was a girl. She said he looked then exactly the way he looks now." Molly absorbed this. "That's impossible." "That's what I said when she told me." Petra folded the cloth. "She told me I was young, and that impossible was a word for people who hadn't seen enough yet." "Where does he live?" "On the hill. Further up than where you were, I'd guess. No one goes up that far. Not since old Renner's son tried, about 10 years ago, said he wanted to see what was up there." She paused. "He came back before nightfall looking like he'd been shaken loose from something. Wouldn't say what he saw. Wouldn't go back." Molly turned the cup slowly in her hands. "Has he ever hurt anyone?" "Valen." Petra was quiet for long enough that the silence itself became an answer of sorts. "Not that anyone can prove," she said at last. "There was a man, came through the valley 6 years ago, a trader, rough sort. He'd been taking things from people on the road, threatening families who had nothing." She straightened. "They found him at the edge of the northern forest 3 days later. He was alive, unharmed, as far as anyone could tell. But he left the valley that same day and never came back, and 2 families he'd robbed on the road found their goods returned to their doorsteps by morning." Molly looked at her. and people think Valen did that. People think Valen arranged it, Petra said carefully. There's a difference. From the corner, without looking up from his game, one of the old men said, "He brings wood." Molly turned. The man, white-haired, weathered, with hands that had spent decades doing physical work, was moving a stone piece across the board without lifting his eyes. Every winter. To the families that can't get enough before the roads close. Stacked at the door before dawn, so no one sees who left it. He finally looked up. His eyes were sharp. "My wife's been dead 11 years. I've found wood at my door every winter since. Never asked for it, never thanked anyone, because there's no one to thank." The alehouse was very quiet. "So why does everyone fear him?" Molly asked. The old man set his piece down. "Because some things that are good for you are also things you don't understand," he said. "And people fear what they don't understand more reliably than they fear things that actually hurt them." Petra made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. She picked up her cloth again and turned back to the shelves. Molly finished her broth and set the empty cup down. She had her facts. They didn't resolve the question. They complicated it, the way facts had an inconvenient tendency to do. Valen was old in a way that shouldn't be possible. He kept himself apart from the village, but quietly ensured it survived its winters. He was feared by some, quietly respected by others, and no one truly knew what he was, and he had told her to take what she needed. She stood, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and walked back out into the snow. Chapter 5. The Storm and the Shelter. The blizzard arrived that evening without much warning. Molly had seen the sky change in the late afternoon, the clouds coming in from the north, heavy and gray-green in the way that meant serious weather, not the light snowfall of the past days. She spent an hour reinforcing the cottage as best she could, stuffing rags into the gaps in the walls, banking the fire high, bringing Rex's sleeping mat closer to the hearth. She had enough grain now for several days, enough dried fish to last a week. The shelter on the hill had made the difference she hadn't let herself hope for. But the storm, when it came, was worse than she'd prepared for. By the time full dark arrived, the wind was pushing against the cottage walls hard enough to make them flex. The sound was constant and enormous, a low roar that swallowed every other sound and made the interior of the cottage feel very small and very fragile. The fire fought to stay alive, guttering every time a particularly strong gust found the chimney. Rex pressed himself against her leg and trembled, not from cold, she thought, but from the sound. Somewhere around midnight, the left wall gave. Not collapsed, not catastrophically, but the oldest section, where the mortar between the stones had been crumbling since autumn, buckled inward under the pressure of the wind, and a section of the wall the width of her arm opened to the outside. The cold that poured through was immediate and savage. Snow followed within seconds, fine and driving, reaching the fire before Molly could react. The fire went out. She stood in the sudden dark and cold, in the howling noise of the storm, with Rex pressed against her and the temperature already dropping with terrifying speed. She had no time to think carefully. She had no time to weigh options or consider consequences. She pulled her cloak around herself, grabbed Rex's rope lead. She had never used it, but she knotted it to his collar now because she could not lose him in a whiteout, and opened the cottage door. The wind hit her like something physical. She leaned into it, head down, and moved. She could not see. That was the truth of a blizzard, that no one who hadn't experienced one could fully understand. It wasn't that visibility was poor, it was that visibility ceased to exist. There was only white, and noise, and cold, and the only way to navigate was to know where you were going before you lost the ability to see where you were. She knew where she was going. Up. She moved through the snow by memory and muscle, the slope, the angle, the way the ground changed under her feet from flat village earth to the rougher terrain of the lower hill. Rex moved with her, close and steady, and she kept her hand on his back as much as she could. Once she fell, hard, and the snow came up to meet her face, and she lay still for a second. The terrifying second where you wonder if this is where you stop. And then Rex's nose was at her cheek, warm and insistent, and she pushed herself up. She found the stone outcropping by feel. Her hand struck the rock in the darkness and she followed it, scraping along the face until her fingers found the wooden edge of the doorframe. She pulled. The door resisted. Snow had packed against the base of it. And she pulled again, harder, and it swung open, and she and Rex fell inside together. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. She lay on the stone floor for a moment, breathing. Rex shook himself violently beside her, sending snow in every direction, and then pressed his full weight against her side. She sat up slowly. The shelter was dark, no lamp, no fire, no light except the faint gray quality of the storm through the open door. She pushed the door shut behind her and sat in the darkness for a long moment, listening to her own heartbeat slow. She was alive. Rex was alive. The food was around her on the shelves, and the stone walls did not flex in the wind, and the cold was held mostly outside where it belonged. She was reaching for the doorframe. There had been an iron holder for a lamp. She remembered seeing it on her first visit. And where there was a holder there might be a lamp, when she heard breathing that was not her own and not Rex's. She went completely still. From the back of the shelter, where the darkness was deepest, came a voice she recognized. "There is a lamp," Valen said quietly. "On the third shelf, left side. The flint is beside it." Molly did not move for 3 full seconds. Then, because panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford, she reached for the third shelf on the left side and found the lamp exactly where he had said it would be. Her fingers found the flint beside it, a small striker, smooth with use. She worked it twice before the spark caught, and the small flame rose inside the lamp's glass chamber and pushed the darkness back. Valen was sitting on the floor at the far end of the shelter, his back against the stone wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him. His dark cloak was pulled around his shoulders, and he was watching her with those gray eyes that gave almost nothing away. He looked entirely unsurprised to see her. He looked, if anything, as though he had been expecting her, which was a thought she set aside for later, because there were more immediate things to address. "Your wall," he said. "The left side gave," she said. "The mortar has been failing since autumn." He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already assessed. "How much of it?" "A section, wide enough that the fire went out in under a minute." She set the lamp on the shelf and looked at him steadily. "Why are you here?" "Same reason you are," he said. "The storm is worse on the upper hill. This shelter is the soundest structure in the area." It was a reasonable answer. She couldn't find anything in it to argue with, which was slightly irritating. Rex, who had been shaking snow from his coat near the door, walked the length of the shelter and lay down approximately 1 pace from Valen's feet. Close but not touching, the way he positioned himself near people he had decided were acceptable. It was a significant distance shorter than he maintained around most humans. Molly pulled her cloak tighter and sat down against the opposite wall, the lamp between them on the floor, the storm a constant low roar outside the stone. The shelter felt smaller with 2 people in it. Not uncomfortably so. The ceiling was low enough that the space retained warmth quickly, and the lamp added more heat than its size suggested. But she was aware of him in the way you became aware of a fire when you were cold. Unavoidably. With some confusion about whether awareness was the same thing as comfort. "Petra warned me about you," she said. "I know," he said. "You know everything that happens in this valley." "Not everything." A pause. Enough. She studied him in the lamplight. His face was angular. Strong jaw, a scar along the left side of his neck that disappeared beneath his collar. the kind of stillness in his features that wasn't blankness, but rather a very deliberate management of expression. He was looking at the lamp, not at her, and in the orange light he looked older than he had on the hill, or perhaps more accurately, he looked like someone who had accumulated a great deal of time and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. "She said you don't age," Molly said. "That her mother remembered you looking the same when she was a girl." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "That's accurate." She waited. "You're not going to ask me how," he said. "I'm waiting to see if you'll explain it without being asked," she said. "People explain the things they want you to know. What they stay silent about tells you more." Something shifted in his expression, subtle, like a door opening a crack before someone decided whether to open it further. "You're careful," he said. "I've had to be." "So have I." He looked at the lamp again. The flame moved slightly in some small current of air, steadied, burned even. "What I am," he said after a long moment, "is something this valley has no proper name for. What I look like is a man. What I am entirely is not only that." "Petra said until he doesn't," Molly said quietly. "Petra is a practical woman who respects things she can't explain by maintaining a safe distance from them." He said it without criticism. "She's kept her village alive through a great deal by doing exactly that." "But you stock a shelter full of food on a hill above that village," Molly said. "Every winter. For people who have no idea it's there." "Some people know," he said. "The old man at the alehouse. The wood at his door every winter." Valen looked at her with something that might have been surprise, or its quieter cousin, the recognition that someone had seen more than expected. "Old Kale," he said. "Yes." "Why?" she asked. "You stay apart from them. You let them fear you. You let them tell stories about lights on the hill and sounds in the dark. And then you quietly make sure they don't freeze or starve." She held his gaze. "Why?" The storm pressed against the door. Rex breathed slowly on the floor between them. "Because I have been here a long time," Valen said, finally. And there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Not quite heaviness, but the quality of a word that was carrying more weight than it appeared to. "And in that time, I have watched things I could have prevented. People I could have helped, if I had not decided that distance was the safest arrangement for everyone." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I learned it too late for some, not too late for others." Molly sat with that for a moment. The lamp flame steadied. "The mark on the wax seals," she said. "The jars. What is it?" "A ward," he said. "It keeps the contents from spoiling faster than they should." She thought about what that meant. What kind of knowledge produced marks that preserved food through a winter? She thought about her mother's folded letter in its cloth pouch on the shelf, and about the things she herself carried that she had never shown anyone, and she decided that people who kept old things close were rarely simple. "My wall needs to be rebuilt," she said. "Yes. I don't have the materials or the skill to do it myself." "No," he agreed. "Are you offering?" she asked directly. He looked at her then, fully, with those gray eyes that were not warm exactly but were not cold either, that occupied some careful space between the two. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because it needs doing," he said, "and I am here." Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside the stone shelter, the lamp burned small and steady, and Molly decided that for tonight, that was enough of an answer. Chapter 6. Old Wounds and Older Secrets. He rebuilt the wall in 2 days. He arrived both mornings before she was fully awake, and she found him already working when she came outside, mixing mortar in a battered iron pail he had carried down from somewhere on the upper hill, fitting stones with a precision that suggested he had done this kind of work before, many times. across a span of time she was still adjusting to. He did not ask her to help, but he did not send her away either, and she found herself handing him stones when he needed them, holding sections in place while the mortar set, making herself useful in the wordless way she was accustomed to. Rex supervised from a position near the woodpile, occasionally standing and repositioning himself closer to Valen. The second afternoon, when the wall was finished and the mortar needed time to cure, they sat on opposite sides of the cottage's small table with cups of hot water steeped with dried herbs from the shelter's shelves, mint and something bitter she didn't recognize. And the conversation moved in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "You arrived in the valley with almost nothing," he said. It was not a question, but it had the shape of one. "Almost," she agreed. "From the east, by the direction of your first wagon tracks. Someone who knew the old roads." He turned his cup slowly. "You came alone?" "Yes." He looked at her. That careful, thorough attention. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm deciding whether I want to." She looked at the cloth pouch on the shelf. She hadn't moved it. She thought about Petra's warning and old Kale's quiet testimony, and the way Valen had said I was wrong about that, with the weight of genuine regret, not performance. "I had a position," she said finally. "In a household to the east. A large one. I was a record keeper. I managed accounts, correspondence, supply inventories." She paused. "The man who ran that household discovered I had found an irregularity in the records. Money being moved in a way that would have eventually destroyed a great number of people who depended on that house for their livelihood." She set her cup down. He was not grateful for the discovery. "He removed you," Valen said. "He removed me with considerable efficiency and made certain that no household of similar standing would take me on afterward." She said it evenly, the way she had learned to discuss it, as a sequence of events, not a wound. "The letter in that pouch is a dismissal document, written to ensure I couldn't contest it." Valen was very still. "I came west, until I found a place where no one had heard of the house I'd come from," she said. "That turned out to be here." "The man's name," Valen said quietly. She looked at him. His voice had not changed. His expression had not changed. But something in the quality of the air around him had shifted. Something she felt rather than saw. A density, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," she said clearly. "I'm not offering to." A pause. "I'm asking because I like to know the shape of things." She told him the name. He nodded once, slowly, and looked at his cup, and said nothing more about it. But she noticed that his hand, wrapped around the cup, had tightened briefly, and she noticed that it took a moment before it relaxed again. That evening, after he had gone, she found a second lamp on the doorstep, filled with oil, with a note tucked beneath it. Not words, just the angular mark from the wax seals, pressed into a scrap of leather. She held it in the lamplight for a long time. Chapter 7. The Man from the East. He arrived on a Thursday, which Molly knew because she had begun keeping track of days again, a habit she had abandoned in her first desperate winter and recently resumed, which felt like a small form of reclaiming something. She was at the lower path when she saw him. A traveler, which was unusual in midwinter. The roads were passable now only in the narrow strips where the wind had scoured the snow thin, and only for someone with a strong horse and a reason worth the risk. He was riding a dark bay animal that was clearly exhausted, foam dried along its neck, and he wore a heavy cloak with a distinctive stitched border along the hem, a pattern she recognized with a cold certainty that stopped her feet in the snow. It was the pattern used by the household she had left. The man himself was perhaps 40, lean, with a narrow face and quick eyes that moved across the village as he rode through it with the assessing quality of someone conducting a search. She stepped back against the wall of the nearest building and watched him pass, her heart moving faster than she wanted it to. He stopped at the alehouse. Of course he did, because Petra knew everything, and a man asking questions would go to the person most likely to have answers. Molly stood in the snow for a moment, thinking quickly and clearly the way she always thought when the situation required it. He had found her, or found the valley at least. Whether he had found her specifically depended on what he was asking and what Petra chose to say. She needed to think. She needed high ground, literally and otherwise. She turned and walked toward the hill. She was halfway up the lower slope when she heard Rex bark. Sharp, urgent, from somewhere above her on the path. And then she heard a second sound beneath it, from behind her, from the village below. Her name, called in a voice she didn't recognize. She didn't stop walking. She didn't run, because running announced guilt. She kept her pace steady, her chin level, her eyes on the stone outcropping above. She had been found before. She had survived it before. But she had been alone then. She wasn't entirely certain whether the thought that followed, "You aren't alone now," was a comfort or the beginning of an entirely new set of dangers. She reached the shelter before the man reached the hill. Rex was already at the door, standing with his weight forward, ears up. Not the curious posture he held for things he was deciding about, but the older, stiffer stance of an animal that had made a decision. She pressed her hand briefly to the top of his head and pulled the door open, and they went inside. And she did not light the lamp because she did not want the light visible beneath the door's lower edge. She sat in the dark and thought. The man's cloak border, the household pattern, stitched in dark thread along the hem. She had catalogued enough fabric orders to recognize it without hesitation. He had come from Lord Edrin Voss's estate. That was the name she had given Valen 2 days ago, sitting at her small table with cups of herb water between them. Edrin Voss, a man who managed his accounts with one set of numbers for public record and another set for personal use, and who had learned that Molly had discovered the difference. She had cost him nothing in the end. She had only found the irregularity. She had not yet reported it when he moved against her. But the knowledge that she possessed was enough to ruin him if she ever chose to use it, and men like Edrin Voss did not leave that kind of exposure unaddressed. He had found her. It had taken 2 years, but he had found her. She sat in the dark with her back against the shelves and her hands folded in her lap, and she was not afraid, precisely, because fear was an emotion that required a surplus of feeling she had mostly redirected into practical function. She was, however, acutely aware of the situation's dimensions. She was a single woman with no legal standing in this valley, no family to appeal to, and a dismissal document specifically designed to discredit anything she said. He was a man of significant wealth and connections who had sent someone a long way through difficult winter roads to find her. The door of the shelter opened. She pulled back instinctively, and then the figure in the doorway resolved itself, and she let the tension out of her shoulders. Valen stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He did not ask for the lamp. He sat down across from her in the dark, with the ease of someone for whom darkness was not a particular inconvenience. "There is a man in the village," he said. "I saw him," she said. "He's from Voss's household." "I know." A pause. "He's been asking Petra where you live." "What did she say?" "That she doesn't keep track of where people live." Something in his voice suggested he found this mildly satisfying. Old Kale told him he'd never heard the name. Duff the farmer said he thought someone by that name had passed through in autumn heading further west. Molly absorbed this quietly. People who had individually shown her nothing warmer than cautious tolerance had, without coordination or instruction, closed around her like a hand. She found she had to set that thought aside quickly, or it would undo her composure entirely. "He'll keep looking," she said. "He's been riding hard in midwinter. He isn't going to leave because the alehouse keeper was vague." "No," Valen agreed. "He won't." "What do you know about him?" His name is Gregor Fenn. He manages Voss's external affairs, which means he handles situations Voss cannot address through ordinary channels. A pause. He has done this before. Other people who left Voss's employment carrying inconvenient knowledge. Most of them chose to sign documents recanting what they knew in exchange for being left alone. Molly was very still. And the ones who didn't choose that? The silence that followed was its own answer. He has no authority here, Valen said. This valley is not within Voss's jurisdiction. Whatever documents Gregor Fenn carries are meaningless in Dunrath. That rarely stops men like him, she said. No, Valen said. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, do you still have the original record? The one showing the irregularity? She had not told him about the record. She looked at him in the dark. How did you know about that? Because you kept a dismissal document you could have burned 2 years ago, he said. People keep documents they might need, and you are not someone who acts without purpose. She was quiet for a moment then. I copied it before I left. The relevant pages. I kept them. She paused. In the pouch, with the dismissal letter. Another silence. Longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was even, measured, and carried beneath its surface something that was not quite anger but occupied the same region. That document, he said carefully, would be of significant interest to the regional magistrate at Aldenmere, who has, for the past year, been investigating irregularities in several large households along the Eastern Trade Corridor. He paused. Voss's estate is among them. Molly stared at the dark where his face was. How do you know that? I told you, he said. I have been here a long time, and I know the shape of things. Chapter 8. The Weight of Old Things. Gregor Fenn found the cottage the next morning. Molly was inside when she heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, the kind that announced authority rather than requesting welcome. She opened the door. He was standing in the snow outside, his dark bay horse tied to the fence post, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been traveling in the cold for a long time and was ready to be finished with it. Molly Vane, he said. Yes, she said. He reached into his cloak and produced a folded document with a seal she recognized. Lord Voss requires your signature on a statement of retraction. Sign it, and your past employment is considered settled. Refuse. He let the word sit there like a stone dropped into still water. Come in, she said. He blinked. He had not expected that. She stepped back and he came inside, ducking slightly under the low doorframe, and he stopped when he saw that she was not alone. Valen was standing near the hearth, his arms at his sides, his gray eyes on Gregor Fenn with an attention so complete and so still that the other man instinctively took a half-step back. Rex stood at Valen's right side and did not move. Who are you? Fenn said. Someone who lives in this valley, Valen said simply. Fenn looked between them, recalibrating. He was experienced enough to understand that the situation had dimensions he hadn't assessed. He turned back to Molly and placed the document on the table. This is a straightforward arrangement, he said. Sign it, and I leave today. I have a counter-arrangement, Molly said. She placed her own document on the table beside his. The copied pages from Voss's accounts, folded carefully and preserved for 2 years in a cloth pouch. These are copies of the original records I found, she said, showing the movement of funds from 3 separate accounts over 4 years, in amounts that don't correspond to any transaction in the public ledger. She met Fenn's eyes. You know what they show. Fenn looked at the pages. Something moved across his face. Not quite fear, but its practical cousin. Those documents are the property of... The records I made are my own work, she said calmly. I made them. They belong to me. She straightened. There is a magistrate at Aldenmere, currently investigating estates along the Eastern Corridor. I am told Lord Voss's name has come up in that investigation. She paused. I am also told that a direct submission from a former account keeper, with supporting documentation, would be considered significant evidence. The room was very quiet. Fen looked at Valen. Valen looked back at him with the expression of a mountain, present, immovable, entirely without malice, and entirely without mercy. Lord Voss, Molly continued, has two options. He withdraws his pursuit of me, permanently, in writing, and in exchange I submit nothing to the magistrate. Or he continues, and everything I have goes to Aldenmere by the next available courier. She folded her hands. I have no interest in destroying him. I only want to be left alone. Fen was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his document from the table, folded it carefully, and returned it to his cloak. I'll need 3 days to send word, he said. You can use 4, she said. The roads are difficult. He left without another word. His horse's hoofbeats moved away through the snow and faded into the valley's silence. Molly stood at the closed door for a moment, then turned. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, the body accounting for what the mind had kept controlled. Valen crossed the room and set a cup of hot water from the pot on the table in front of her without being asked. He sat down across from her, and Rex lay down between them on the floor, and the fire in the hearth burned steadily, and outside, the snow fell with the quiet indifference of things that continue regardless. You knew he would come, she said. I thought it was likely, he said. The magistrate at Aldenmere, you arranged that, the information reaching the right people. He looked at his cup. I mentioned to someone I know in Aldenmere that certain documentation from the Eastern Corridor might be forthcoming. That is all. That is not a small thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? He met her eyes. Because the wall was not the only thing that needed fixing, he said quietly. Epilogue. What remains? Gregor Fenn's written withdrawal arrived on the 5th day, carried by a young rider who handed it over without ceremony and turned back east before dark. The document was brief and formal, and bore Edrin Voss's seal. Molly read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the cloth pouch alongside the dismissal letter and the copied records. Then she set the pouch on the shelf and did not look at it again for a long time. She sent her own documentation to the magistrate at Aldenmere the following week. She had decided, in the quiet after Fenn's departure, that the arrangement she had offered Voss was the right one, but that it didn't require her silence about what she knew, only her distance from his affairs. The magistrate's investigation was not her pursuit. It was simply a mechanism she could contribute to, honestly, and she did. The investigation concluded 4 months later. Edrin Voss paid a substantial settlement and lost his position on the Regional Trade Council. 3 families whose funds had been diverted were compensated. Molly received a formal letter of acknowledgement from the magistrate's office, which she also put in the pouch, and which she found, unexpectedly, made the pouch feel lighter rather than heavier. Petra, when she heard the broad outlines of what had happened, she heard them from old Kale, who heard them from Duff, who had overheard more than he let on during Fenn's visit, came to the cottage one morning with a wrapped parcel of good bread and a pot of preserved plums, and set them on the table without preamble. She stayed for 2 hours, and talked about the valley's history, with an openness she had not previously shown Molly. She did not apologize for her warnings about Valen. She did not rescind them either. She simply talked, and Molly listened. And when Petra left, she stopped at the door and said, "You're not passing through anymore, are you?" It was not a question. "No," Molly said. "I don't think I am." Petra nodded once, with the expression of someone filing a fact away for future use, and walked back toward the village. Old Cale's wood appeared at Molly's door that winter, and every winter after, though she was never without wood anymore, and Cale knew it. She stacked it anyway and said nothing about it, because some things are not about need. The shelter on the hill remained. Molly helped stock it in the autumn. She had a talent for inventory and logistics, which turned out to be genuinely useful for organizing preserved goods. And she and Valen developed a quiet habit of work that required no explanation. They were not the same kind of person. He was ancient in ways she was still mapping, and she was particular and precise, and had a sharp edge she had honed over years of navigating the world without assistance. But there was a quality to their company that neither of them tried to name, because naming things sometimes made them smaller than they were. What she knew about him by the end of that second winter: he was not entirely human, and had not been for longer than any record in the valley could account for. He changed on certain nights, in ways that explained the lights on the hill and the sounds that didn't come from any animal anyone could name. He had watched over this valley since before Petra's mother was born. And before that, and before that. He had made mistakes he had not forgiven himself for. She recognized that quality, because she knew what it looked like from the inside. And he had decided at some point that distance was not the same thing as protection. Rex lived through that winter, and the one after, slow and white-muzzled and content, sleeping most often near the hearth in Molly's cottage. He died on a morning in early spring, 3 years after she had found him injured at the forest's edge, and Molly buried him at the base of the stone outcropping on the hill, in a spot where the sun reached in the afternoon. She did not ask Valen to help, but he was there when she finished, standing quietly in the pine-scented air. And he said nothing except what needed to be said, which was nothing at all. Dunrath survived every winter after that. The shelter never ran empty. And Molly Vane, who had arrived at the edge of the valley with 3 jars and a worn pair of boots and a folded letter she couldn't bring herself to burn, became the person who kept the records. Not of accounts this time, but of people. Who needed what, and when, and how to get it to them before they needed to ask. She was good at it. And on the cold mornings when she climbed the hill with Rex gone, and her breath making clouds in the sharp winter air, she sometimes thought about the version of herself who had stood at the cottage door 3 years ago, watching an old dog walk into the snow, toward a hill she'd never thought to climb. And she thought, as she pushed open the shelter door and stepped into the smell of pine and preserved food and old stone, that the most important decisions of a life were rarely the ones you made deliberately. Most of them were made by following something you trusted, into the white, without knowing what was on the other side. She lit the lamp. She began the morning's work. Outside, somewhere on the upper hill, something moved through the trees with a sound like wind, and the valley held it, and the valley was quiet, and the valley endured.